Robert Kelso Smith is a mountaineer and high-altitude guide based in Scotland near Fort William, though he hails from County Tyrone in the north of Ireland. He has spent over 25 years guiding in some of the most extreme environments on Earth, doing so with great skill and passion, and a clear love for adventure in the outdoors. A quick look at his bio on Adventure Consultants and Madison Mountaineering show the high esteem he has held in by fellow guides and clients. It was a real privilege to get the chance to speak to Robert before he headed off on what would be another highly successful expedition to Everest. As always, I began the episode with Robert by asking him, why the mountains?
Well, that's a good question. I think partly, we're all born with an innate sense of kind of wonder and exploration. And as we get older, that gets drummed out of us, whether in school or by our society or whatever. But that was never successful. It was never drummed out of me, so I just wanted to keep going to the mountains after I had discovered them, and go further and higher. And you keep doing that and you end up on Everest. Obviously, there's nowhere higher to go.
It's certainly true that for some people, that innate sense of adventure does get lost as we get older. And it is the lucky ones amongst us that keep it going into adulthood, though not all of us go as far and as high as Robert. I asked him about his first experiences in the mountains.
Not really as a child. I didn't have much exposure in Northern Ireland at all. Grew up in Tyrone, West Tyrone. And didn't really know anybody who's into the outdoors. And it wasn't until I moved to Scotland to study that I had that exposure, and I thought, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is a whole new world. And that's when it started, really. So I suppose at the age of 18, came across to do a sports management course. And the second week of that course, he brought us up to the Scottish Highlands, and we did an outdoor element. And that's when I just, it blew me away. I realized that's what I wanted to do. And then I specialized in that outdoors component of the course. So, there were lecturers delivering that who were absolutely, fundamental to my development. Yep. Barry Smith, Neville Crowther, John Cheeseman, they were all fabulous.
Most mountaineers would agree that there is no better proving ground for aspiring mountaineers than the Scottish Highlands, and Robert was in the right place and learning from the right people. But unlike many, it wasn't something he was introduced to as a child. I asked him about some of his early experiences in the mountains and when he realised he was able for the higher peaks.
I followed the fairly normal path. Scottish summer, hill walking, rock climbing, led on to Scottish winter climbing. And then I remember going to a slideshow, which was about the Alps. And I was just like, oh, wow, that looks amazing. I want to go there. Went to the Alps in summer and then progressed onto the greater ranges, Alaska, Bolivia. And then I applied for a job to go to Antarctica, went to Antarctica. And basically, I just went, further and further and ended up in the Himalayas. I think 2010 was my first expedition to go to the Himalayas. So it's very, very sequential, really. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it didn't really strike me at the time, but the higher you go, the more difficult it does get. And I'm not going to say I wouldn't have any problems with that. I'm human just like everyone else, but I was able to cope, able to look after other people when they were having a harder time. So, it struck me that I could perform at those altitudes.
Robert's first experience of the Himalayas may have been in 2010, but he had been gaining valuable experience working in Antarctica. I asked him about this.
I've been going for best part of 20 years now. I actually met a friend of a friend who had worked for British Antarctic Survey. And, he told me a bit about the job. The job sounded pretty interesting. And again, it wasn't until I think I was shown some slides, which we had back in the day, and it just again opened my eyes to that landscape and that environment. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, you know. And the advice back then was, oh, just apply, get your name sort of in that circle, you know. That's why I applied, not expecting anything to come of it. But anyway, was asked for interview and got offered a post, you know, that same year. So I went down as a field assistant, called Field Guides now with British Antarctic Survey. And, you know, again, once you've been once, it kind of gets under your skin. It's an amazing place to visit and work in, and it's a real privilege. So I've gone back almost year after year. I work shorter seasons now. So I work for a commercial company and do between 2 and 3 months of the year in Antarctica over our winter, which is the southern summer. I was away this year, December, January, just got back beginning of February. So you're assigned to a science team in a project, and, you know, your job is everything bar the science, basically. So logistics, communications, the guiding, whether you're on a glacier or mountains. But now I'm working for a commercial company, and they do an element of science support, but a lot of it is commercial guiding. So people who want to climb Mount Vinson, which is the highest mountain in Antarctica, a lot of those people are doing the 7 summits, and also ski trips to the South Pole. I've done a couple of trips from the coast to pole, full distance, and we do shorter ones, which are more popular. It's called the Last Degree. You ski 60 nautical miles to South Pole. It takes about a week. But we've done a lot of film support for documentaries, some feature films. I've run trips to an emperor penguin colony, you know, for that experience. So I've had a very, very career really in Antarctica. It's been great.
What an amazing experience Robert has had in Antarctica, and it's hard not to be envious of his work life. I asked him a bit about what changes he has observed throughout his 20-odd years working there.
Yeah, when I first went down with British Antarctic Survey, that was to a base called Rothera, which is 67 degrees south, so just below the Antarctic Circle. And I actually passed through that base 2 years ago on the way to a different destination. But the temperatures there are much warmer now. They get above zero, you know, it rains instead of snows, which would have been unheard of when I was back there 20 years ago, and now it's just, you know, it's common. So you see less of that the further inland you go, but definitely around the coastal fringes, there's a lot of glacial retreat. Temperatures are rising for sure. So there's between 100 and maybe 150 people a year would climb Vinson on a busy year, and that's spread over 5 rotations. So it's still, in 7 summit terms, it's a quiet mountain. But it's popular by, you know, whoever wants to complete that kind of challenge. You need to go to Antarctica and climb Mount Vinson. I didn't think I'd be probably spending so much time abroad on an expedition. You know, that was something you maybe did once a year or twice a year, something like that. And that was the exception. And you'd expect to spend the rest of the time probably, you know, in the British Isles, maybe a bit in the Alps. Whereas now I spend pretty much 6 months of the year abroad, guiding trips on expeditions.
I could have listened to Robert all day, talking about working with the British Antarctic Survey. But it was the 8,000-metre mountains, and Everest in particular, I was interested in for this series. And Robert was guiding almost from the very start.
Went to Makalu in 2010. And in hindsight, it was over-ambitious. We tried to do a new route on Makalu and didn't succeed, but, you know, that's the mountains. And then the following year, I guided a trip to Choyu in 2011. So that was my first 8,000-metre summit, was Choyu. I'd say yes, no. It's definitely a challenge, but it's not like that's your first job that you attempt to do. You know, I'd guided on 6,000-metre peaks, 7,000-metre peaks. So for me, it was a natural progression. And of course, the stakes are higher. And and it's a different level of challenge. But I don't always see as challenge converting into pressure, I guess. I found that I could cope and climb well at altitude and look after other people. I talk a lot to my groups about, effects of altitude and altitude illness, and no one is immune. Everyone's human. And some people say I never feel the effects of altitude. Well, that's just not true, because your body is acclimatizing whether you're aware of it or not, really. But yeah, I've always coped well at altitude. But of course, every trip is different. That's also something I tell people. If you've had a good experience, it doesn't mean you'll have an easy ride the next trip, or vice versa. Just because you've had a rough trip doesn't mean that the next one will be just as bad.
Robert has guided many of the 8,000-metre mountains, including Everest. Before getting on to Everest, I asked him about his 2 trips guiding on K2, including some overlap on the mountain with other Irish climbers.
So both those trips were pretty different. 2018 I went, and we had 3 guides, 10 clients, and a big Sherpa team of 10 also. So that was a well-supported trip. Second trip was very different. I was actually supposed to be going to Broad Peak on a 1-to-1, and my client pulled out at the last minute, and we were supposed to bolt on to the K2 trip for base camp and logistics and everything. And I ended up still traveling to Pakistan. A lot of work had gone into making that trip happen. It was just post-COVID 2021. So everybody had worked really hard to make the trip happen. So I still wanted to support it. I went out to Pakistan. I joined the K2 team, and there was just 2 clients that year. And there was already 2 guides. So I stepped in as an extra guide. One of the guides stepped back, and we were just 1-to-1 in 2021. It was a good trip. Noel was climbing 1 day ahead of us, which was great. So the day he summited, he came down, and we saw him in Camp 4, High Camp, and he was happy as you can imagine. And I was climbing with Jason. Yeah, I was guiding, and Jason was a client on that trip.
We will hear a bit more from Robert in future episodes on Noel Hanna and on Ger MacDonald, 2 Irish climbers who achieved great things in the mountains, but tragically died doing what they loved. We moved on to speak a little bit more detail about Everest and how he prepared for it, and what he knew of the history of the North Side.
I was with a British company back then called Adventure Peaks, who you might know from the Lake District, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they operate, or did then, on the north side of Everest, the China-Tibet side. And I went there in 2013 with another guide. Yeah, it was a successful year. It was a good year to go. It's definitely a step up. You have to have your best game head on, because I had summited Choyoyu, but that's 8,211 meters. And Everest is almost 9,000, so you're talking about a significant increase in height. And also the route on the north side of Everest, it's quite rocky. It's a long traverse to the summit. So yeah, it was definitely a big step up from Choyoyu. Yeah. I did more of what I had done for every other mountain, and I always think that be as best prepared as you can be, whether that's fitness or research or equipment. So all of those things, you really want no element of doubt when you're on the mountain itself. So I just did more of the same, I guess, for every other mountain. I was very much so, yeah, and that was partly why I was keen to go to the north side. It's got a very different feel to it from the south side. And I love that early history of Mallory and Irvine. Did they, didn't they? It's 100 years this year. It's the centenary of their attempt. And I think it's great that still nobody knows conclusively for sure whether they summited or not. But I think what people miss out is just how incredibly high they got with so little. 100 years ago, the clothing and equipment they had. And, they definitely got to 8,500 meters minimum, which was an absolutely amazing achievement with what they had. Yeah, well, no one's quite sure of the conditions. One of the theories is that it could have banked out with snow, so it wasn't so much a sheer rock as opposed to a snowy ramp. That's possible. Definitely Mallory was a talented rock climber, but climbing that rock at 8,500 meters is a whole different ballgame, and probably in the condition they were in. I think it would probably be too much, but you don't know what conditions were like the year they were there. They could have found an easier way around it, an easier way up it, and yeah, nobody knows for sure.
A lot of Robert's work has been with adventure consultants, and anyone who is remotely interested in the history of Everest will recognise the name from the film Everest, which focuses on the tragic loss of life that occurred in a storm on the mountain in 1995. I asked Robert what it was like to work for them.
I thought it was fantastic to be asked by adventure consultants. They're one of the longest established companies when it comes to high altitude guiding. And actually first year I went with them in 2015, I decided not to go back to Everest North Side. I'd climbed it twice and was like, okay, maybe it's time for something different. And I worked in the Antarctic season and got a message from Guy, and he phoned up and he was like, what are you doing this spring? And I was like, I'm not sure, but I'm not going to Everest. And he said, well, do you want to come to Everest with us? And I was like, oh, wow. So it was a big thing to be asked to work for adventure consultants, and yeah, they're excellent company to be part of.
Somewhere down the line, I will do an episode on the 1995 disaster on Everest. It is something I've been fascinated with ever since hearing about it at the time, and devouring any book or piece of reporting I could find on the events. The main characters, Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, Doug Hansen, Anatoly Bukreev, Beck Weathers and many more, and the role they all played in the events are intriguing, and worth a couple of shows for sure, but that is down the line. In the meantime, I highly recommend Into Thin Air by John Krakauer and The Climb by Anatoly Bukreev, though there are many other excellent books, of course. I probably have them all. Robert was on Everest when the disaster of the avalanche in the Khumbu icefall struck. I asked him about this time and how the discussions went with his team on the north side.
Well, 2014, we were on Everest North Side, and actually when the ice collapse happened, we were at base camp on the north side. And, I think everybody was just reeling from the news, basically. And tragically, a Sirdar that I climbed with on Choyoyu and some other peaks was killed on that side. So that really affected everybody. Everybody knew Dorji. And then I guess it was the unknown. We were all asking, should we continue? Can we continue? And turned out the north side of the mountain stayed open, didn't close down like the south side. So we continued with the climb after discussion, and we summited, and it was a very quiet year that year because most of the traffic comes from the south side. Yeah, it was a successful but sad, expedition, because we ended up back in Kathmandu at the end of our trip, and the mood was very, very somber, obviously, about what had happened on the south side. Yeah, there was a discussion, and I guess we were obviously geographically removed from it, and I think that led to a lot of people wanting to continue. If you witness something or if you have firsthand experience of it, then you're much more likely to be affected by it. But because there was that sort of buffer between us and the event, after discussion, everybody wanted to continue.
Robert was also there in 2015 when the Nepal earthquake hit, with a magnitude of 7.8, which is a very powerful earthquake, killing thousands of people causing catastrophic damage across the country, including in base camp on Everest. 19 people were killed in base camp, including some members of Robert's team.
Yeah, we were at Camp 1. We had left base camp the day before on our first rotation up the mountain. And we had actually planned to move above Camp 1 that day. Excuse me, but because of low cloud and snowfall, we stayed in Camp 1. And when the actual earthquake happened, you felt the ground moving below you, which actually I had experienced before on a previous 8,000 meter mountain, oddly enough. So part of me was like, here we go again. And then we could hear, seracs collapsing nearby around us, but we couldn't see anything because we're sat in low cloud, very similar to what base camp was. And then we had a bit of a blast wave and debris hit our camp, but nothing was seriously damaged or broken. And it wasn't until we called down to base camp to tell them we were okay that we realized, the devastation down there. And our natural reaction was, how do we get down there? How do we help? But there was no way through the icefall. The icefall is probably the most precarious section of the mountain, and even when it's fully fixed, it's very tenuous, and there'd just been a major earthquake, which had upset, ice towers, ladders, ropes. So a couple of guides did go down and have a look, and there was still a lot of aftershocks happening, a lot of tremors. And again, you never knew if it was going to be as big or bigger than the previous one. So they realized there was no way through, so we just had to sit tight, which was hugely frustrating. We couldn't help anybody else. And we just had to wait until we could get flown off the mountain. I believe there were one or two teams at Camp 2. And we actually thought about moving to Camp 2 for greater safety, because Camp 1 has been wiped out in the past through serac fall. But in the end, we remained at Camp 1, and the groups at Camp 2 came down to Camp 1 and were all evacuated from there. As you said, there was a national disaster in Nepal, and Everest was just a very small part of that. So there were places in much greater need of assistance and helicopters. And also, as you know, base camp, there were dead, critically ill, wounded. So it wasn't until helicopters became available, they flew to base camp to evacuated the most seriously wounded from base camp, that they could then consider coming to pick us up. And I think we had an extra maybe 2 nights at Camp 1 before we could get back to base camp. Yeah, it'd been absurd to think about the climb. I mean, in our practical terms, it wasn't possible. Our base camp was completely flattened. 6 of our team were killed. Others were wounded, injured. Yeah, so continuing was the last thing in our mind. And also just the state that the country of Nepal was in. It would have been, crazy to think about continuing that year. So a few of us stayed at base camp. We were put up short term by another expedition, because, as I say, there was nothing left of our base camp. And there was still lots of aftershocks, lots of debris coming down, which at night was very unsettling because you didn't know the scale of it. You didn't know if something was going to hit camp again. We didn't know what the condition of the route out of base camp was. You cross a lot of bridges, a lot of valleys. And anyway, as soon as we established that the route was open, our team left. They trekked down the valley with a couple of our guides. I stayed in base camp with Guy Cotter and Scott Simper from Adventure Consultants, Suze Kelly, and we basically picked up the pieces. And it was like a bomb site or an aircraft crash. There was just debris I don't know, up to a kilometer away from camp. Uh, and we just did our best to collect it all, pick up the pieces, literally. Um, and then after that, we trekked down the valley and we visited the homes and families of our Sherpa who had been killed and injured. And that was awful, because obviously they had just lost their um, sorry.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine, Robert. Um, it's, how long did it take you to come back to Everest? Did you come back the following year? I know there was climbers the following year, or did you leave it a little while?
I did come back the next year. When we actually reached Kathmandu, we got together with our team. A lot of them we hadn't seen since before we left base camp, because those who were injured were flown out before we were flown down to base camp. So we got together. Basically, we visited those who were in hospitals, those who weren't in hospital, we got together. And we had a meeting. We paid them, obviously, for their season. And they were all there with their, arms and plaster, and their scalps had been shaved. There was a lot of head wounds and, big stitches in their heads. And anyway, partway through this kind of get together, they asked, "When are you coming back?" And it really struck me at that time. We were reeling from the event and thinking, are we ever coming back? What are we doing here? But to them, it was much more. It wasn't just, about a climbing trip. It was their livelihood they were concerned about. So I decided there and then that, yep, I just said, yeah, I'll be back next year. And that's a promise I made and a promise I kept.
You can hear from Robert the awful impact of this event, in particular on the Sherpa community, but you can also hear how important the Everest season is to that community and how keen they were, even in the face of this terrible disaster, to keep going the following year. I asked Robert a little more about the importance of the Sherpa and the increasing recognition that they are rightly receiving.
Oh, they're absolutely essential. 99% of the people who summit Everest couldn't do so without Sherpa support. And it's kind of crazy when you see all these Instagram posts and Sherpas don't get any credit. These people have done it themselves or whatever. They're absolutely essential, whether they're working on the mountain beside you or, carrying things up to camp or just carrying things to base camp. It just wouldn't happen without Sherpa support. Yeah, very much so, and rightly so. Yeah, the Sherpa film, it goes quite far back now with Russell Bryce. I knew Russell well, and that was kind of the first thing on a big screen that people realized, the essence of what they do. I think Nims's project obviously introduced a lot of people to it, and then I think that the winter ascent of K2, for me, that was a watershed moment. That pure Sherpa team. There was a big discussion in 1953, who got to the top of Everest first, and was Tenzing just an assistant, or was he a key player? And I think, winter K2 just basically that was a defining moment, and it proved how kind of capable the Sherpas are, and rightly so. It gave them the recognition for everything of the decades beforehand, I would say.
Robert has made a living in the mountains and the frozen landscapes of Antarctica, but as he has said, the complexion of this has changed over the years. He is perfectly placed to see this, working for big companies like Adventure Consultants and Madison Mountaineering. I asked him about the increasing commercialisation of the mountain, which of course, working for these companies he is a part of, the future of guiding on Everest, and the future for himself, and what advice he might have to young aspiring mountaineers.
In part, it's a natural evolution, just as things get more popular. Marathons have got more popular. rowing the Atlantic has got more popular. Climbing Everest has got more popular. And I think it's wrong when some people have had the experience to then say, no, it's not for you, and kind of pull up the ladder or whatever. But I do think it could be managed much, much better. And whether that's through just limiting numbers or prerequisites or the management of the numbers, it could be done much better. Yeah, I think you should certainly start at base camp and finish at base camp. A lot of people on descent fly down from Camp 2 now, claiming whatever cold injury or altitude illness. In reality, most of them are just tired and want to go home. So I think, you should definitely start and finish at base camp. I think the express programs do appeal to some people who just can't get 2 months off work. So there's definitely a number of folks who can only spare whatever it is, 5 to 6 weeks. They just have to be aware of the, success rate for them or the chances of a summit. And I think there's been a natural evolution of Nepalese companies, which is very natural, and that's great. But there's no regulation of those companies, so some are great, some are not so good. And anybody going to Everest just really has to do the research. There's usually a reason a company is significantly cheaper than their competitors. Yeah, and I think it's amazing that the places I get to go to, the mountains I get to climb. So I'm keen to continue. Obviously, there's a balance with family life also. So we'll just have to manage that as it goes, really. Yeah, give it a go, first and foremost. Don't think it's not for you. Don't think it's impossible. Give it a go, see if you enjoy it. So whether that's joining a club or doing a course or something like that, but just get out there. You don't have to buy loads of expensive equipment to dip your toe in. And see where it leads you.
That's it for this week. Happy New Year to everyone out there. I really hope you're enjoying the series. We still have a few more weeks of this series to go and more interesting interviews to hear. Please join us again next week. And also, please do get in touch with us on whythemountainspodcast@gmail.com, Instagram at whythemountainspodcast, and Facebook. And in the meantime, stay safe and stay cool.